Your mind never fully rests. It constantly races through endless loops, refusing to give your weary spirit a break. Every single thought creates another frantic question, spiraling outward into a massive, overwhelming maze of deep anxiety. Another heavy fear. You constantly worry about the absolute worst outcomes, letting dark shadows violently shake your confidence. Another unpredictable possibility. Your internal compass spins wildly out of control, entirely unable to settle on a clear direction. Your scattered thoughts keep multiplying rapidly. Like dark ink spreading through water, chaotic confusion completely clouds your clarity. Even over incredibly small things, tiny details suddenly feel like massive decisions pulling you in opposite, frustrating directions. Simple, everyday moments quickly become violent mental storms, rippling with intense pressure and completely distorting your peaceful reality. Your exhausted mind keeps desperately searching for certainty, trying to perfectly predict a future that you cannot control. But it absolutely never finds peace. You wander down an endless, dark corridor of worries with no exit. So the painful habit of overthinking grows much deeper, twisting its heavy roots beneath your mind's fragile surface. Quietly, the intense, restless energy shakes your inner foundation, completely unseen by everyone standing in the silent room. Relentlessly, the heavy shadows of your deep doubts repeat themselves over and over across your mind's empty walls. One anxious thought quickly becomes 10 more, colliding together in a chaotic flood that entirely overwhelms your stillness. And your heavy soul feels incredibly exhausted, buried deep beneath a hopelessly tangled mess of completely unanswerable questions. Because your racing mind never actually slows down. It just keeps narrowing the dark, suffocating hallway of fears. Even during moments of complete silence, the harsh, invisible wind of anxiety constantly threatens to extinguish your calm. Even during physical rest, the tightening pressure spirals endlessly inward, keeping your weary body awake while your mind sprints. And your heavy heart quietly, desperately longs for peace, searching for a distant, warm light beyond the massive maze. Overthinking often begins with fear. It starts as a quiet whisper that quickly turns into an overwhelming mental storm. Fear of mistakes. You wander endlessly through the heavy fog, terrified that one wrong turn will ruin absolutely everything. Fear of uncertainty. The chaotic spinning in your mind leaves you entirely lost, desperately searching for a clear path. Fear of losing control. The harder you try to perfectly manage every single detail, the more trapped you feel. So your mind checks everything repeatedly. You frantically replay every past conversation, looking for any hidden, terrifying mistakes. Every possibility, you violently crash through endless what-ifs, creating massive waves of anxiety over things that haven't happened. Every outcome, the constant heavy mental pressure slowly shatters your peaceful reality into sharp, disorganized fragments of deep worry. Every small detail, the tiny things that most people easily ignore, completely consume your exhausted, heavily burdened mind. Because anxiety keeps asking impossible questions, it forces you to constantly race against a broken clock that never rests. What if something goes wrong? You constantly brace for an imaginary disaster, letting the heavy shadows suffocate your light. What if you fail? The narrow, suffocating walls of perfectionism close in, making forward movement feel completely, utterly impossible. What if people reject you? The deep, heavy roots of insecurity completely break through the fragile surface of your confidence. So your thoughts never settle. You are entirely trapped under the massive weight of carrying 1,000 conflicting directions. Even simple decisions feel exhausting. Choosing a basic path becomes a monumental, draining task that entirely depletes your energy, because your mind deeply fears uncertainty. The harsh wind of the absolute unknown constantly threatens to blow out your peace and tries controlling everything. You frantically attempt to completely still the chaotic waters, but your desperate efforts just create more turbulence. But endless thinking never creates genuine peace. It just quietly traps you in a completely dark, heavily repeating cycle. Only exhaustion, the massive, unrelenting mental pressure, entirely cracks the fragile foundation of your weary, heavily burdened spirit. Still, your heavy soul beautifully longs for calm. Deep down, you desperately crave a quiet, deeply secure resting place, for complete silence inside the chaotic noise. Endless mental control slowly steals absolute peace directly from your weary soul. Eventually, the mind becomes utterly exhausted. The constant, frantic energy of trying to control everything simply burns out. Not from life itself. It is not the daily tasks that drain you, but the heavy, invisible mental battles. But from endless thinking, the relentless cycle of overanalyzing every single detail completely depletes your heavy, weary spirit. Your thoughts never fully stop. They weave a thick, complicated web that suffocates your ability to simply exist. Even during quiet moments, when the outside world finally slows down, your internal waters continue to anxiously churn. Even at night, when you desperately lay down to rest, the frantic trembling inside your mind keeps you awake. So genuine rest becomes incredibly difficult. Your heavy eyes may close, but your troubled mind continues running marathons. Peace feels entirely distant. You spin wildly through endless decisions, completely unable to find a secure, comforting direction. And your weary soul feels completely overwhelmed. The tiny flame of your energy is nearly suffocated by the dark. Small worries quickly become crushing emotional weight. Tiny fractures in your peace slowly spread into massive, paralyzing fears. Simple thoughts transform into suffocating pressure. The walls of your mind close in, making it incredibly hard to breathe. Because heavy anxiety magnifies absolutely everything. A single drop of doubt rapidly pollutes your entire pool of quiet clarity. And the racing mind simply cannot slow down. You are locked in a dizzying, repetitive cycle of pure exhaustion. You desperately keep searching for emotional relief. Wandering blindly through twisted paths, you ache for a clear, calm exit. But your anxious thoughts forcefully keep returning. They violently shake your fragile peace, refusing to let you completely settle. Again, the identical, heavy worries pace back and forth across the silent, empty rooms of your completely drained mind. And again, you stare through the relentless mental storm, barely able to see the faint, comforting glow of hope, until your exhausted soul quietly, desperately longs to surrender. You simply cannot maintain this frantic, heavy pace any longer. For true, lasting stillness, you crave a profound mental silence where the chaotic noise of overthinking finally, beautifully stops. For absolute peace beyond overthinking, you yearn for a divine light to cut through the exhausting darkness of your fears. Jesus understands exhausted minds. He sees the heavy, chaotic labyrinth of endless thoughts you wander through every single day. Even the thoughts you cannot stop, he gently reaches into the frantic noise, soothing the restless fears you constantly battle. He sees your hidden anxiety. He notices the incredibly tight knots of worry that silently suffocate your deeply weary spirit. Your fear, the terrifying cycles of overthinking, slowly begin to lose their grip as his comforting light pours quietly in. Your emotional exhaustion, the violent crashing waves of your mind finally begin to settle into a profound, beautifully safe calm, and the pressure inside your mind. He stands steadfast in the center of your mental storm, offering absolute, unconditional security. Because peace does not come from control, it never comes from trying to perfectly predict or manage every unpredictable outcome. It comes from surrender. Letting go of your desperate grip allows your trembling flame to burn with calm, confident clarity. Your soul was never created to carry this. You were meant to be held securely, not to hold absolutely everything. To carry endless mental fear, the heavy, dizzying spin of worst-case scenarios gently dissolves inside his unconditional, vast, warm love. Jesus gently quiets the chaos. He gracefully silences the loud, ticking panic of constantly feeling like you're out of time. Not through pressure. He never demands that you instantly fix yourself or suddenly turn off your deeply ingrained, anxious habits. But through his presence, the massive, intimidating storm of overthinking naturally breaks apart just by knowing he is standing near. Your thoughts begin softening slowly. The harsh, distorted reflections of your deep insecurities are beautifully washed over by his warm truth. Because grace feels incredibly safe, it creates a completely steady sanctuary where your exhausted, racing mind can finally entirely let go. Safe enough to rest, you no longer have to blindly navigate the dark because his light clearly reveals the peaceful way. Safe enough to breathe, the heavy, suffocating anxiety gently washes away, leaving an incredibly still, deeply refreshing inner quietness. Even while uncertainty still exists, you realize you don't need to perfectly know tomorrow because you are securely held right now. Peace slowly returns. The overwhelming darkness that entirely clouded your exhausted mind is completely driven out by his radiant, enduring warmth. Not because every answer magically appeared. The path might still have complex turns, but you are absolutely no longer walking alone. But because your soul stopped carrying everything alone, you finally handed over the heavy, impossible burden of controlling the whole universe. And the chaos inside begins fading. The loud, demanding noise of your worries gently fades away into a beautiful, quiet hope. Little by little, sitting beside his peaceful presence, your fractured, racing thoughts are slowly, carefully woven back into absolute, gentle harmony. Your heart finally remembers true rest. The deeply exhausted, overthinking mind is given full permission to completely and safely shut down. Healing begins when the mind slows down. The frantic, exhausting race to solve every potential problem finally, beautifully pauses, and the soul stops chasing certainty. You realize you no longer have to perfectly predict tomorrow to be safe. Your thoughts become quieter. The incredibly tight, anxious knots inside your mind gently begin to unravel in the light. Less fearful, the terrifying cycles of deep overthinking gently wash away into a comforting, radiant, and profound, peaceful warmth. Less overwhelming, the chaotic, turbulent waves of your daily anxiety beautifully settle into a crystal clear, entirely steady surface. Because grace softens anxiety slowly. Walking quietly beside him, your weary spirit learns how to breathe freely once again. The pressure inside your mind fades. The heavy, dark clouds of endless worry naturally part, revealing a brilliant sky. Your heart breathes easier. You no longer spin wildly looking for direction because you are safely anchored right here. And emotional exhaustion begins lifting. The draining need to constantly protect yourself melts away in this deeply secure space. Because healing changes how the soul carries fear. You courageously step forward without needing to analyze every single turn. You stop needing every answer. The urgent, demanding voice of your anxiety is beautifully replaced by a gentle trust. And slowly trust peace again. The bright, comforting warmth reminds you that you are entirely allowed to feel calm. Even while uncertainty remains, the massive, intimidating unknown no longer terrifies you because his profound peace guards your mind. Your mind no longer feels trapped. You stand brightly illuminated, free from the heavy chains of constant, exhausting overthinking, because his presence stays steady. Even when your own thoughts falter, his absolute faithfulness provides a perfectly secure foundation. Even when life feels unclear, the overwhelming need to deeply manage every detail surrenders beautifully to his vast grace. The anxiety loses strength slowly. The deep, painful fractures in your exhausted confidence are tenderly filled with divine warmth. And your soul feels lighter. The heavy, distorted mirror of your endless worries is beautifully replaced by absolute truth. Because peace finally feels possible again. You look forward with genuine hope, no longer anticipating a dark, inevitable storm. And rest slowly returns to the heart. Wrapped perfectly in his profound comfort, your mind beautifully learns to pause. Peace feels unfamiliar at first. When your mind is so used to constant anxiety, genuine stillness can feel strange. Because your mind carried pressure too long. You lived in heavy survival mode, constantly bracing for the next storm. But slowly the chaos fades. The frantic, exhausting noise in your head beautifully begins to settle into absolute quiet. Your thoughts become quieter. The incredibly loud, anxious questions about tomorrow finally stop echoing through your weary spirit, and your soul breathes easier. The suffocating weight of endless overthinking completely lifts, leaving a beautifully clear, open space. Not completely certain. You might not have every single answer, but you no longer need them to feel secure, but finally calmer. The dark, terrifying walls of your mental labyrinth gently open up to reveal a bright path. Because peace no longer depends on control, you gracefully surrender the impossible need to perfectly manage every unpredictable outcome. Grace teaches the heart to rest, standing completely still beside him. Your deeply exhausted spirit discovers a secure refuge. Even during uncertainty, his radiant warmth perfectly fills the unknown, proving that you do not have to walk alone. The anxiety slowly loosens. The tight, heavy grip of worry entirely softens, allowing your trembling inner flame to steady. The pressure feels lighter. Your mind finally stops demanding absolute perfection, completely resting in the beauty of his grace. And your mind stops fighting itself. The exhausting internal war gently ends, replaced by profound, uninterrupted, and absolute harmony. Because healing stayed, the divine warmth filling your fractured thoughts is not temporary, but an incredibly safe, permanent home. Your soul finally feels safe resting. Under his steadfast watch, the terrifying urge to overanalyze every small detail disappears. And silence no longer feels heavy. You can beautifully exist in the quiet, completely free from the chaotic noise. Overthinking is not your identity. The endless, exhausting loops of anxiety do not define the person you are. Neither is fear. The heavy, paralyzing panic that used to control your decisions is finally washing away. Healing changes the way your mind feels. The overwhelming mental pressure naturally dissolves into a deep, comforting stillness. Little by little, the dark, terrifying maze of overthinking opens up into a clear, beautiful, and secure path. You stop fearing every uncertainty. Without needing to predict tomorrow perfectly, your heart finally trusts the journey. Because grace stayed beside you, his completely steadfast presence remained your secure anchor through the fiercest mental storms. Even during mental chaos, when your racing thoughts felt entirely out of control, his love never once wavered. Even during emotional exhaustion, when you had absolutely no strength left to fight, he safely held your spirit. The fear slowly loses control. Its heavy, demanding grip on your daily life completely surrenders to divine warmth. And your weary soul feels lighter. The thick, invisible walls of your mental prison finally and completely vanish. Because genuine peace heals deeply, it touches the most exhausted, frantic parts of your mind with absolute reassurance. Especially exhausted minds, he tenderly revitalizes the spirit that has spent years running desperately on endless, anxious treadmills. You slowly stop living inside mental fear. Breathing in the fresh morning air, you courageously embrace actual freedom. And finally begin resting again. You realize that stepping fully into his calm is perfectly, entirely, and always safe. Maybe your mind was never weak. Perhaps you were simply being incredibly strong for much too long without resting. Maybe it was simply exhausted. Your weary spirit absolutely drained itself trying to fiercely protect you from everything. Exhausted from carrying endless fear, the heavy burden of constantly anticipating disasters completely shattered your inner quietness. And searching for certainty everywhere, you spent years desperately looking for a perfect guarantee that absolutely never existed. Even when peace was still possible, you were so completely busy predicting storms that you entirely missed the calm. And Jesus stayed near the chaos. He never once abandoned your side when the mental noise became completely deafening. Even during your overthinking, when you felt entirely lost in endless loops, his grace beautifully and securely held you. Even during emotional exhaustion, when you had no strength left to pray, he perfectly understood your silent, weary tears. Because healing happens slowly, he tenderly mends your fractured peace without ever rushing your fragile, recovering heart. Quietly, the overwhelming panic gradually subsides, beautifully replaced by an incredibly deep, enduring, and radiant inner stillness. Patiently, he waits with you absolutely faithfully, allowing your exhausted spirit to completely relearn the rhythm of secure grace, until the soul finally remembers peace. Enveloped completely in his boundless love, your heavy mind realizes it is safe. Your mind does not need to carry endless fear forever. The exhausting, heavy burden of anxiety will beautifully pass. Neither does your heart. You do not have to live in a constant state of overwhelming, defensive panic. Healing slowly changes anxious thoughts. It gently untangles the massive, terrifying knots of worry into absolute clear stillness. And grace slowly restores the soul. Standing beside his quiet strength, you finally remember what true security feels like. Because peace is still possible, the beautiful, comforting light of hope remains entirely unbroken by your darkest thoughts. And your heart finally learns how to rest. Surrounded by his profound love, you are completely safe to breathe.